The farmhouse doors swung open on a crisp autumn Sunday in 1944. Inside, a Nebraska farmer's wife stood wiping flour from her hands, the smell of roasting chicken and fresh-baked bread drifting through the doorway. On the porch, three young men in faded Vermach uniforms shifted their weight nervously, caps clutched in calloused hands. They had been taught to expect brutality from Americans. Torture, starvation, revenge for the war their nation had unleashed upon the world. Instead, the woman smiled. "Come in, boys. Dinner's almost ready." Behind them, an American MP leaned against his jeep, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He'd seen this scene play out a dozen times before. Enemy soldiers, captured on distant battlefields, now standing hesitant at the threshold of American homes. What happened next would astonish everyone involved: prisoners and guards, farmers and their families, and eventually the world itself. This is the story of over 400,000 German prisoners of war who arrived on American soil expecting the worst and found something that defied every principle of warfare they'd ever learned. It's the story of Sunday dinners that became acts of quiet rebellion against hatred, of apple pies that dissolved propaganda, of children who asked questions that no ideology could answer, and of how simple human kindness, extended across enemy lines, would plant seeds of reconciliation that would outlast the war itself. From the port cities of the East Coast to the wheat fields of Kansas, from Texas cattle ranches to Minnesota dairy farms, this was democracy made real, not in speeches or treaties, but in the clinking of silverware, the passing of potatoes, and the bowing of heads in prayer at tables where enemies became guests. They arrived as captives. They left as witnesses to something unexpected: the power of an open door. The troop ships that carried German prisoners of war across the Atlantic in 1943 and 1944 moved through water haunted by their own submarines. Irony hung thick as the salt spray. Many of these men had served in the Kriegsmarine or fought alongside U-boat crews. Now they rode as cargo in the holds of American vessels, listening to the throb of engines and wondering what fate awaited them on the far shore. For Oberrighter Hans Weber, captured at Caseran Pass in Tunisia, the voyage began with certainty of his own death. Nazi propaganda had been explicit. Americans were savage, vengeful people who would torture prisoners and execute them without mercy. The SS had distributed pamphlets showing fabricated images of brutalized German soldiers. Better to die fighting, the propaganda insisted, than surrender to such monsters. Yet here he was, alive, fed twice daily, with rations that exceeded what German civilians received back home. Guarded, yes, but not beaten. The cognitive dissonance gnawed at him during the week-long crossing. Through portholes, when guards permitted, prisoners caught glimpses of the convoy's protective screen: destroyers cutting through the swells, aircraft circling overhead. The sheer scale of American military power became impossible to ignore. These were not the desperate, defeated people Berlin had described. This was a nation at the height of its industrial might, projecting force across an entire ocean. Seasickness plagued many during storms. In the cramped holds, men who had marched across North Africa or endured the Russian winter now vomited into buckets and clutched their bunks. But even in their misery, they noticed something. The American sailors who checked on them daily showed neither cruelty nor mockery, just weary indifference, the same expression worn by soldiers everywhere who wanted the war over. When the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon, for those lucky enough to see it, the symbolism wasn't lost on the prisoners. Liberty. What a word to greet men in chains. The port cities of Norfolk, New York, and Boston swallowed them in organized chaos. Massive cranes swung cargo onto docks. Warehouses stretched farther than village squares back home. Mountains of supplies, crates of food, barrels of fuel, lined up in rows that seemed endless, testified to an abundance that made German wartime austerity look medieval by comparison. Unteroffizier Friedrich Müller, who had watched Berlin's shops grow emptier each year since 1941, stood on the dock at Norfolk and simply stared. It was like stepping onto another planet, he would write decades later. We had been bombing England for years, yet here was America, untouched, overflowing with everything we lacked. In that moment, I understood we had already lost the war. Military police formed them into columns. The guards carried rifles but didn't brandish them threateningly. Orders were given firmly but without the screaming brutality of Vermach drill sergeants. This confused the prisoners almost as much as the abundance. Where was the hatred? Where were the beatings they'd been promised? The train journeys inland became voyages of revelation.
Pressed against windows, German soldiers watched America unfold in a tapestry that contradicted every lie they'd been told. Farmlands stretched to horizons without a single bomb crater. Small towns displayed white church steeples rising peacefully into blue skies. Children played in yards, women hung laundry, old men sat on porches. The war existed somewhere else, across oceans, beyond mountains. But here, life continued in rhythms that seemed pulled from a peacetime dream. At train stations, crowds sometimes gathered. Not angry mobs, but curious citizens who wanted to see the enemy up close. Mothers held children on their hips. Teenagers craned for better views. The prisoners expected jeers, perhaps stones thrown. Instead, they received stares. Suspicious, yes, but mostly just curious. Some people even waved. This unnerved them more than hostility would have. "Why aren't they angry?" whispered one prisoner to another as their train passed through a small Iowa town. His companion had no answer. Their confusion deepened with every peaceful mile. Camp Clarinda, Iowa, Camp Hearn, Texas, Camp Como, Mississippi, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. Over 500 camps, some housing just a few dozen men, others holding thousands, sprouted across America's interior like temporary cities. The U.S. Army had designed them following Geneva Convention guidelines to the letter, not from altruism alone, but from strategic calculation. Treat prisoners well, and fewer American soldiers would die in German captivity. The camps themselves astonished their new inhabitants. Rows of wooden barracks? Yes. Barbed wire fences? Certainly. Guard towers with searchlights that swept the compounds at night. But inside those perimeters existed a world that bore little resemblance to the concentration camps or POW facilities the prisoners had heard about on the Eastern Front. Each man received a bunk. Not a wooden plank or straw mattress, but an actual bunk with springs and blankets. Heating stoves kept barracks warm through northern winters. Latrines weren't trenches but proper facilities with plumbing. Showers provided hot water. For men who had spent years in field conditions, sleeping in frozen mud, going weeks without proper washing, this seemed like luxury. Then came breakfast. The mess halls served eggs. Actual eggs, not the powdered substitute German civilians had been eating since 1942. Bread with butter, porridge sweetened with sugar, coffee, real coffee, not the acorn or chicory mixture that had become standard in Germany, and portions that exceeded Wehrmacht rations. Lieutenant Carl Becker sat at a table in Camp Trinidad, Colorado, staring at his breakfast plate as if it might be poisoned. Around him, fellow prisoners ate tentatively, then with increasing enthusiasm. One man began to cry quietly. When asked why, he explained that his family's letters from Hamburg described near-starvation conditions, children begging for scraps, his mother's ration card providing barely enough bread to survive. And here he sat, a prisoner, eating better than German civilians. The guilt was crushing, the gratitude unavoidable. Daily routines emerged with German efficiency meeting American pragmatism. Reveille at dawn. Roll call where guards counted heads but rarely raised voices. Work assignments that kept men occupied but not brutalized. The Americans understood that idle prisoners made trouble, so they organized activities with remarkable thoroughness. Workshops appeared within camps. woodworking shops where prisoners crafted furniture, picture frames, and decorative items, tailoring stations where skilled men repaired uniforms or created new garments from supplied materials, cobblers fixed boots, mechanics maintained camp vehicles. The work wasn't just busy work. Prisoners took pride in their craftsmanship, maintaining standards that would have pleased any German master craftsman. Sports became obsessions. Soccer fields materialized, and prisoners formed teams that competed with intensity that rivaled any league match back home. The sound of Germans shouting encouragement, arguing over fouls, celebrating goals, echoed across compounds. American guards watched with bemused tolerance, sometimes even joining pickup games during slow shifts. But nothing surprised prisoners more than the libraries. The YMCA and Red Cross supplied German-language books, classics by Goethe, Schiller, and Thomas Mann, technical manuals, even some philosophy texts, carefully screened to exclude Nazi propaganda. American newspapers and magazines arrived too, translated by prisoners with English skills. For the first time in years, German soldiers could read about the outside world without the filter of Goebbels' propaganda ministry. In the libraries of Camp Alva, Oklahoma, prisoners discovered Life magazine. The photographs revealed an America they hadn't imagined. Women working in factories, families gathering for picnics, baseball games, Hollywood movies. It was ordinary life, the kind that had vanished from Germany years ago. Some prisoners devoured these magazines, while hardline Nazis tried to discourage such contamination. The camps developed their own internal politics. Wehrmacht officers, still maintaining military hierarchy, attempted to enforce discipline in Nazi ideology. They held formations, conducted inspections, and punished perceived disloyalty among the ranks. But their authority eroded gradually as men realized the war was lost and these American captors weren't monsters. Healthcare shattered remaining illusions. Each camp maintained medical facilities staffed by American doctors and sometimes German POW physicians. When Gefreiter Otto Schmidt developed appendicitis in Camp McCain, Mississippi, American surgeons operated within hours. He woke in a clean recovery room, attended by nurses who checked his vitals and brought him juice. In the Wehrmacht, he later recalled, "I would have died waiting for a field hospital. Here, they treated me like their own soldiers." Dental care, vaccinations, treatment for injuries sustained before capture. The medical attention provided to enemy prisoners exceeded what many had received as German soldiers. Men who had marched on frostbitten feet, suffered untreated infections, or lived with broken bones that never healed properly found themselves receiving care they'd only dreamed of. The cognitive dissonance became inescapable. How could these Americans, whose nation was locked in mortal combat with Germany, treat prisoners with such attention to their well-being? It violated every principle of warfare the prisoners understood. Evening activities added another layer of surrealism. Orchestras formed within larger camps, using instruments supplied by the Red Cross. German prisoners played Beethoven and Bach in American barracks, while guards listened outside. Theater groups staged productions of German classics, building sets and sewing costumes with obsessive detail. The performances became events, with prisoners filling makeshift auditoriums and applauding enthusiastically. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, prisoners formed a band they called the Camp Clinton Swingsters. They played American jazz and swing music, attempting to master the complex rhythms. The results were sometimes comically off-key, but the effort itself represented something profound. The enemy absorbing the culture of their captors, finding joy in music that Goebbels had banned as degenerate. Nights brought reflection. In barracks after lights out, men spoke in whispers about the contradictions of their situation. They were prisoners, yes, trapped behind barbed wire thousands of miles from home. But they were safe, fed, warm, treated, if not with affection, then at least with basic human decency. Letters home became exercises in careful wording. The censors read everything. But even within those constraints, prisoners tried to communicate the strange reality of their captivity. "I am well," they wrote. The food is adequate. I am being treated fairly. Between those lines, families in Germany might read the subtext. Their sons, husbands, and brothers were surviving captivity better than civilians were surviving the war. The barbed wire remained. Freedom was denied. But within those fences, German prisoners encountered something unexpected. A glimpse of a society that functioned, prospered, and maintained its humanity even while waging total war. The experience was planting questions that propaganda had never prepared them to answer. By 1943, American agriculture faced a crisis that threatened the war effort itself. Millions of young men had traded overalls for uniforms, leaving farms desperately short-handed. Crops rotted in fields because there weren't enough workers for harvest. Livestock needed tending. Food production, essential for feeding both civilians and military forces, hung in the balance. Victory gardens in cities helped, but couldn't replace commercial agriculture. The solution arrived in khaki uniforms and work boots, speaking broken English or no English at all. The War Department, operating under Geneva Convention provisions, authorized prisoner labor programs. German POWs could work outside camps under guard supervision, receiving token wages paid in scrip redeemable at camp canteens. Farmers desperate for help overlooked the obvious irony. They were about to employ the enemy to keep America fed. The first work details departed camps with heavy security. MPs accompanied every truck, rifles at the ready, though they quickly learned that escapes were rare. Where would a German soldier go in rural Kansas? With blonde hair, limited English, and a face that screamed foreigner, any escapee would be caught within hours. Most prisoners recognized this and didn't bother trying. But that first morning when trucks rolled up to farms and prisoners climbed down to face American families, that was the moment everything changed. John Hartley, a wheat farmer outside Hutchinson, Kansas, remembered the arrival of his first work crew in June 1943. 5 Germans stepped off that truck, and I swear they looked more nervous than me. My boy was fighting somewhere in Italy against their army, and here I was shaking hands with the enemy in my own driveway. It felt wrong and necessary at the same time. The prisoners, for their part, approached with military formality. They stood at attention, waiting for orders. The MP explained the work schedule, dawn to dusk with breaks for water and lunch. Payment through the government, no fraternization, just labor. Then Hartley handed them tools, pitchforks, rakes, shovels, and pointed towards the fields. What happened over the following weeks repeated itself across rural America with surprising consistency. The Germans worked hard. Not with the forced labor brutality of concentration camps or Soviet gulags, but with the practiced efficiency of men raised on farms themselves. Many came from agricultural regions, Bavaria, Saxony, rural Prussia. They knew crops and animals. They understood seasons and weather. They worked with the quiet competence that earned grudging respect.
In Texas, Gefreiter Heinrich Vogel found himself milking cows alongside a rancher's teenage son. The boy spoke no German. Heinrich spoke no English. But cows don't care about language barriers. They demonstrated techniques to each other through gestures, how to calm nervous heifers, the rhythm of hand milking, the care needed with bulls. By the end of the first week, they worked in wordless synchronization. The Americans noticed details. These Germans repaired tools carefully rather than breaking them through carelessness. They treated livestock gently. When equipment malfunctioned, prisoners with mechanical aptitude often diagnosed and fixed problems that would have required expensive repairs. One farmer in Nebraska discovered his German workers had completely rebuilt a failing tractor engine during their lunch break, refusing extra payment. Skills revealed themselves. A former carpenter from Stuttgart could frame barns with precision. An electrician from Hamburg rewired a farmhouse, solving problems that had plagued the family for years. A baker from Munich taught a farmer's wife how to stretch flour rations by preparing German-style dark bread that stayed fresh longer. Small gestures of appreciation began. A farmer's wife watching men work through scorching Texas heat brought cold water to the fields, then lemonade, then One day, sandwiches for lunch. The MP shrugged. Where was the harm? The prisoners ate gratefully, nodding thanks they couldn't express in words. In Minnesota, a dairy farmer watched his German workers handle newborn calves with such gentleness that he invited them to see the farm's prize bull. The prisoners admired the animal with the genuine appreciation of men who understood livestock. One sketched the bull in a notebook with surprising artistic skill. The farmer kept that drawing in his barn office for the rest of his life. Children broke down barriers faster than adults. At a farm outside Des Moines, Iowa, the farmer's 8-year-old daughter approached the German workers with fearless curiosity. "Are you really Nazis?" she asked directly. The prisoners looked to their guard for guidance. He nodded permission to respond. One prisoner who spoke halting English knelt to her level. "We are soldiers," he said carefully. "We fight because we must. But no, not all German soldiers are Nazis." She considered this gravely. "My daddy says the Nazis are bad people." "Your daddy is right," the prisoner replied. That exchange, witnessed by the farmer, planted seeds of a more complex understanding. These weren't faceless monsters from propaganda posters. They were men, young, tired, far from home, caught in a war larger than themselves. Evening returns to camp became less tense as weeks progressed. The early fear of treachery or violence faded when prisoners consistently proved reliable. Some farmers began requesting specific crews, recognizing individuals by name. "Can I get Hans and Friedrich again? Those boys know how to handle my thresher." The extra food started appearing with increasing frequency. A farmer's wife would pack extra sandwiches claiming she'd made too many. Fruit from orchards, apples, peaches, pears, was offered as payment for especially hard work. Sometimes it was pie, wrapped in cloth and handed over with instructions to share with the whole crew. Guards rarely objected. They'd tasted army rations too. For prisoners, these small kindnesses accumulated into something profound. Otto Fischer, working sugar beet fields in Colorado, wrote in his diary, "Today the farmer gave us fresh bread his wife baked. I shared it with Jakob and Werner. We ate slowly, trying to make it last. It tasted like home. Afterward, I cried for the first time since capture, not from sadness, but from confusion. Why are they kind to us?" The answer was complicated and simple at once. Americans, particularly in rural communities, operated on practical values. They needed help. The prisoners provided it. Reciprocity demanded fair treatment. But deeper currents ran beneath that pragmatism, currents of Christian charity, recognition of shared humanity, and perhaps a quiet rebellion against a dehumanization that war demanded. Not everyone approved. Some townspeople grumbled that prisoners were coddled while American boys died overseas. Letters to local newspapers questioned the wisdom of treating enemies as anything other than enemies. Ministers fielded concerns from congregations who worried that hospitality might be misunderstood as sympathy for Nazism. But farmers defended their German workers with surprising vehemence. "Those boys saved my harvest," one told a skeptical neighbor. "My son's fighting to preserve our way of life. Part of that way of life is treating people decently, even prisoners, maybe especially prisoners." By autumn 1943, the sight of German prisoners of war working American farms had become routine in dozens of counties across 24 states. The strangeness never quite disappeared, but it faded into the background of daily life. War and peace existed in the same space. Soldiers who had fought each other now working side by side to bring in harvests that would feed soldiers still fighting. The boundaries were shifting. Not officially, the war raged on. The Geneva Convention still governed treatment, but in the unmeasurable space of human interaction. Guards relaxed, farmers grew friendlier, prisoners stopped expecting cruelty at every turn. And then came the invitations that would transform everything.
It started with coffee. On a crisp October morning outside Minden, Nebraska, farmer Walter Morrison watched his German work crew finish repairing a section of fence that had plagued him for months. The men worked with methodical precision, setting posts with the kind of careful craftsmanship that Morrison's own father would have approved of. When they finished, Morrison did what came naturally to any Midwesterner. He offered them coffee. The MP escort, a corporal from Ohio, looked uncertain. The rulebook didn't explicitly forbid this, but it hadn't exactly authorized it either. Morrison solved the dilemma with frontier pragmatism. He handed cups to everyone, guard included. They stood in the yard, steam rising from tin cups in the cool air, and for 10 minutes, the war felt very far away. One of the prisoners, a former farmhand named Eric, pointed to Morrison's barn and made a gesture suggesting the roofline wasn't straight. Morrison laughed. He'd been meaning to fix that for 2 years. Through broken English and hand signals, Eric explained he'd been a carpenter before the war. By week's end, the barn had a new roof, and Morrison had invited the crew to take their lunch break on his porch. This pattern repeated itself across rural America with organic inevitability. The prohibition against fraternization existed on paper, but eroded daily in practical application. Farmers who depended on these men for their livelihoods found it impossible to maintain rigid hostility. And once basic courtesies crept in, a cup of coffee here, a sandwich there, the distance between captor and captive began to shrink. Martha Henderson, a widow running her late husband's farm outside Weimar, Texas, took things further. She had 3 German prisoners helping her with her cotton harvest, and she watched them work through brutal September heat with grudging admiration. When lunch came, she couldn't bring herself to send them to eat in the barn while she sat comfortably in her kitchen. "You boys hungry?" she called from the back door. The prisoners looked to their guard, a lanky private who'd been reading a book under a tree. He shrugged. "Ma'am, I can't stop you from feeding 'em." She set the table, a simple meal of ham sandwiches, potato salad, and iced tea, and gestured for them to sit. The Germans hesitated at the threshold, caps in hand, uncertain. Stepping into an American home felt dangerous somehow, as if crossing some invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. Martha made the decision for them. "Sit before the food gets warm and the tea gets cold." That lunch lasted an hour. Initially silent, the meal gradually found its rhythm in broken conversation. One prisoner, Werner, had worked on a cotton plantation in Egypt before the war. He knew the crop, understood the challenges. Martha found herself discussing soil conditions and pest control with an enemy soldier in her kitchen. When they left, Martha stood on her porch watching them return to the fields. Something had shifted. She'd seen their faces up close, young faces, tired faces, faces that could have belonged to her own sons if geography had been different. That night, she wrote to her daughter, "I've fed 3 German boys today. I know you'll think I'm crazy, but honey, they're just kids doing what they were told. I can hate Hitler and still feed hungry men." News of these small kindnesses traveled through prisoner networks faster than official communications. In camps, men compared experiences during evening conversations. Those who'd been invited inside American homes described the experience with wonder. The cleanliness of kitchens, the photographs on walls showing American families doing the same things German families did. The realization that these people weren't so different. But suspicion remained on both sides. Some prisoners, particularly officers still committed to Nazi ideology, warned against accepting American hospitality. They saw it as psychological warfare, an attempt to weaken German morale and loyalty. "They're trying to corrupt us," insisted one Hauptmann at Camp McLean, Texas. "Don't be deceived by their kindness. Remember who we are." Others disagreed quietly. They remembered propaganda about American brutality that had proved false. They'd seen abundance where they expected privation, decency where they expected cruelty. Perhaps some began to think everything they'd been told was a lie. American families wrestled with their own doubts.
Benjamin Cole, a farmer outside Lawrence, Kansas, whose son had died at Normandy 3 months earlier, struggled when asked to take German workers. His wife Anna had hung a gold star in their window. The wound was raw, the grief unprocessed. The day the prisoners arrived, Ben stood in his yard with clenched fists, staring at the enemy. These might not be the specific soldiers who killed his boy, but they wore the same uniform, spoke the same language, served the same hateful regime. The MP sensed the tension and moved his hand closer to his sidearm. Anna emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of water. She walked past her husband and held it out to the nearest prisoner. "You'll need this. It's going to be a hot day." Ben didn't speak to the Germans for 2 weeks. He gave orders through the guard, worked separately, took his meals inside while they ate in the barn. But he watched them, saw how carefully they handled his equipment, noticed when one spent his lunch break repairing a wagon wheel that had been broken for months, observed them resting under trees, looking at photographs they carried, photographs of families, not propaganda posters.
On a Sunday morning 3 weeks after their arrival, Anna invited the German crew to join them for coffee after they'd finished morning chores. Ben started to object, but Anna cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. They sat on the porch, Ben and Anna, 3 German prisoners, and a bored MP. Nobody spoke much. Coffee was sipped, birds sang, the morning sun warmed wood that had known better days. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "My son died in France," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. The oldest prisoner, a man named Gustav, who spoke some English, replied carefully, "I am sorry. War takes all our sons." "You got kids?" "2 boys, 7 and 5 years old. I have not seen them in 3 years." Ben nodded slowly. That evening, Anna told the prisoners could eat supper on the porch if they wanted. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was a beginning. By November 1943, the phenomenon had spread too widely to ignore. Military authorities received reports from camp commandants noting increased instances of fraternization. Some officers worried this violated regulations. Others argued it improved relations and reduced escape attempts. A few pointed out that better treatment of German prisoners might result in better treatment of American prisoners of war in Germany, though this hope would prove tragically optimistic. The invitations grew bolder. A Minnesota family invited their German workers to see their daughter's school play. In Louisiana, prisoners attended a barn dance, standing awkwardly at the edges while Americans twirled past them. In Utah, a farming family asked their German crew to help build a new chicken coop, then invited them to share the first eggs. The cultural exchange flowed both ways. Prisoners taught German folk songs, they shared stories about their hometowns, villages Americans had never heard of, cities that no longer existed after Allied bombing. They showed photographs, wives in wedding dresses, elderly parents standing in front of half-timbered houses, children frozen in pre-war innocence. These glimpses into German domestic life humanized the enemy in ways no government campaign could achieve. An Iowa farmer saw a photograph of a prisoner's farm in Westphalia and remarked how similar it looked to his own. A Texas rancher learned that his German worker had also raised cattle, had also struggled with drought, had also laid awake at night worrying about making ends meet. The realization crept up on both sides slowly, unwillingly. The enemy was just another version of themselves, separated by borders and bad leaders. Not every interaction ended in friendship. Some Americans maintained strict distance. Some prisoners remained hostile, clinging to ideology that classified all non-Germans as inferior. But the exceptions were becoming more notable than the rule. Hospitality, that most ancient and powerful of human customs, was working its subtle magic on 2 peoples locked in mortal combat. The stage was being set for something unprecedented, not in military strategy or political agreement, but in the quiet revolution of American families who would soon do something unthinkable: invite the enemy to Sunday dinner. Sunday morning in Concordia, Kansas dawned clear and cold on the first week of December 1943. At the First Methodist Church, the congregation filed in as they had every Sunday since the church's founding in 1887. But this Sunday carried extra weight. 2 families had sons fighting in Europe. One had just received word that her husband's ship had been torpedoed in the Pacific. The gold stars and windows multiplied each month, marking homes where someone would never come home.
Reverend Thomas Mitchell stood in his pulpit and spoke carefully. We're called to love our enemies, not our nation's enemies in the abstract, but the actual flesh and blood enemies that God has placed in our path. That's the hard teaching. That's the one that tests whether we believe what we claim to believe. 3 miles away, at the prisoners of war camp outside town, a different Sunday unfolded. Catholic prisoners attended Mass led by a German priest among their ranks. Protestants gathered for services conducted by whoever could remember the liturgy. They sang hymns in German, prayed for families they hadn't seen in years, and wondered if God heard prayers offered behind barbed wire. Neither group knew they would soon meet. Sarah Brennan, a farmer's wife whose family had emigrated from Germany in the 1880s, spoke fluent German. She'd been thinking about Reverend Mitchell's sermon for weeks. Her brother was fighting in the Pacific. Her 2 sons were too young for service but growing older every day. She had every reason to hate Germans. Instead, she felt something else stirring. A quiet conviction that hospitality, the value her grandmother had taught her, didn't come with exceptions for wartime. After church, Sarah approached the camp liaison officer at the weekly coordination meeting. "Harold, my family would like to invite some of the German boys for Sunday dinner next week. Is that allowed?"
Harold Jessup, who'd been managing these increasingly common requests, pulled out his notebook. "Well, Sarah, it's not technically prohibited, as long as an MP accompanies them and returns them before dark. You sure about this? People will talk." "People are already talking," Sarah replied, "about everything. At least let them talk about something that isn't gossip." The following Sunday, December 12, 1943, 3 German prisoners stepped off an army truck in front of the Brennan farmhouse. They'd been told only that they were invited to a meal. The expectation was probably sandwiches in a barn. What they found was something else entirely. Sarah stood in the doorway of a white farmhouse, wreath already hanging for Christmas, and gestured them inside. "Willkommen," she said in careful German. "Welcome to our home." The prisoners, Johann, a former teacher from Munich, Klaus, a mechanic from Hamburg, and Peter, a farmer's son from Franconia, stepped across the threshold into a world that seemed pulled from their own childhoods. The house smelled like their mother's kitchens, roasting meat, fresh bread, something sweet baking in the oven. Photographs lined the walls, family portraits, graduation pictures, wedding photos. A piano stood in the parlor, sheet music visible on its stand. Sarah's husband Tom shook their hands firmly. No warmth exactly, but no hostility either. The couple's 2 young sons stared with unabashed curiosity until their mother shooed them toward the kitchen. In the dining room, a table had been set with white linen, china plates, the good ones saved for special occasions, silverware polished to brightness. At the center stood a roasted chicken, golden brown and fragrant, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans preserved from summer's garden, fresh rolls and butter molded into decorative shapes. The prisoners stood frozen. This wasn't prisoner rations. This was a feast. "Please," Sarah said, gesturing to chairs. "Sit. You must be hungry." They sat awkwardly, uncertain where to look or how to act. Johann, who spoke the best English, whispered to his companions in German, "This is more food than my family in Munich sees in a week." Sarah caught his words and responded in German, "Then eat well, there's plenty." Before the meal, Tom Brennan bowed his head. The prisoners, recognizing the gesture, did likewise. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for the hands that prepared it, and for those gathered here today. We pray for our boys overseas, for safe return, and for an end to this war. We pray also for those far from home who sit at our table today and for their families back in Germany. Amen." "Amen," the prisoners echoed quietly. That prayer, simple, inclusive, acknowledging their humanity and their homesickness, did more to dismantle their preconceptions than any propaganda could have built. They were enemies at a legal level, but at this table, they were just hungry men being fed. The meal passed in conversation that grew gradually less stilted. Sarah's German wasn't perfect, but it bridged gaps. The prisoners learned that Sarah's grandfather had come from Bavaria, that the family still made traditional German Christmas cookies, that some of the hymns sung in church were ones the prisoners knew by heart. Tom asked about their farms back home. Peter described his family's small holding in Franconia, the apple orchards that his grandfather had planted, the village Christmas markets. Klaus talked about working in Hamburg's dockyards before the war, the pride he'd felt learning his trade. Johann spoke carefully about teaching Latin and Greek to students who probably wouldn't return to their studies now. The Brennan boys, 7 and 9 years old, peppered the prisoners with questions. Do German kids play baseball? What's German school like? Have you ever seen Hitler? The adults tensed at that last question, but Klaus answered simply, once, from very far away. He is shorter than you think. Dessert arrived, apple strudel, made from Sarah's grandmother's recipe. The prisoners tasted it, and tears came unbidden. It tasted exactly like home. Peter pushed away from the table, overcome, and apologized in broken English. Sarah patted his shoulder. It's all right, she said softly. It's all right to miss home. After the meal, Tom suggested they sit in the parlor. Sarah brought out coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz kind the prisoners had grown used to in Germany. The boys showed the prisoners their toy soldiers, innocent of the irony. Johann sketched portraits of each family member in a notebook he carried, giving them as gifts. As the winter sun sank lower, the MP stirred, indicating time to leave. The prisoners stood reluctantly, thanking their hosts with formal precision. Tom shook their hands again, this time with something approaching warmth. Sarah hugged each one briefly, ignoring their shock at the gesture. "You're welcome to come again," she said. "Any Sunday you're available." As the truck pulled away, Sarah stood on her porch watching it disappear down the road. Tom joined her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "People will definitely talk," he said. "Let them," Sarah replied. That evening, the prisoners returned to camp in stunned silence. In their barracks, other men gathered around, asking questions. What was it like? What did they say? How did they treat you? Johann struggled to find words. Finally he said, "They treated us like family. They prayed for us. They fed us from their own table. I don't understand this war anymore." Neither did many others, but the invitations kept coming. By early 1944, the phenomenon had spread across dozens of communities. The pattern was always similar. Protestant or Catholic families, often of German heritage themselves, extending dinner invitations to prisoners working local farms. The meals followed American Sunday traditions: large spreads, family-style service, prayers before eating, and conversation afterward. In Texas, the Miller family invited 6 prisoners for a Sunday barbecue. The Germans, unfamiliar with American-style brisket and ribs, initially approached the meal cautiously before declaring it some of the best food they'd ever tasted. The Millers' teenage daughter taught them a country two-step dance, while her mother played piano. Outside Battle Creek, Michigan, the Catholic Kowalski family included 3 German prisoners in their Sunday Mass attendance before bringing them home for Polish-American dinner. The prisoners, discovering that the Kowalskis spoke both Polish and German, spent the afternoon in trilingual conversation about farming, music, and the absurdity of their situation. In rural Georgia, an elderly couple named Harris, who'd lost their son at Caseran Pass, invited 2 German prisoners, one of whom had fought in that same battle. The afternoon was tense initially, but by dessert, they were looking at photographs together, grieving across the enemy line. The meals transformed both sides. For American families, the prisoners ceased being abstract enemies and became individuals. Johann, the teacher; Klaus, the mechanic; Peter, the farmer's son. They heard about bombing raids that had destroyed the prisoners' homes, about families struggling to survive Allied advances, about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. For the prisoners, these Sunday dinners shattered every preconception about America and Americans. They'd been taught that capitalism made Americans greedy and selfish, that democracy made them weak and decadent, and that their culture was crude and valueless. None of that aligned with being served Apfelstrudel by a grandmother who reminded them of their own Oma, or playing checkers with children who could have been their younger siblings. The tables where these meals occurred became sacred spaces of a sort. Neutral ground where the war temporarily ceased, where humanity trumped nationality, where a simple meal became an act of resistance against dehumanization. Not everyone approved. Camp commanders received complaints from townspeople who thought such fraternization was inappropriate during wartime. Some veterans groups protested that it insulted the memory of fallen American soldiers. Church congregations split over whether Christian charity extended to enemy combatants currently fighting American troops. But the dinners continued, quietly, often without publicity, in farmhouses across America's interior. They continued because the families extending these invitations believed, however imperfectly, in values deeper than wartime hatred. They continued because once you've broken bread with someone, prayed with them, and learned their children's names, it becomes harder to see them as merely the enemy. By summer 1944, even as the Allies stormed Normandy and pushed toward Germany, Sunday dinners in Kansas and Texas and Minnesota created small islands of peace. The contradiction was profound. American soldiers dying to defeat Germany, while American families fed German prisoners from their best china. Yet this contradiction embodied something essentially American: the stubborn belief that how you treat people matters, even people you have every right to hate. Democracy made steel, as one saying went, but also democracy made real in the passing of mashed potatoes, the sharing of stories, and the simple recognition that the enemy across the table was somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. The Sunday dinners were changing the prisoners in ways they wouldn't fully understand until years later. They were witnessing America not as propaganda portrayed it, but as it actually existed. Flawed, certainly, but also generous, complicated, and fundamentally decent in ways that Nazi ideology had insisted was impossible. And when the war finally ended, these memories would travel back to Germany, carried by men who could testify from personal experience. They had met the enemy, and the enemy had invited them to dinner. Music broke through language barriers faster than any dictionary. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, on an evening in February 1944, a prisoner named Wolfgang pulled a harmonica from his pocket during rec time. The notes of Ich hatten einen Kameraden, a German funeral march, drifted across the compound. Other prisoners stopped their activities, standing silent as the mournful melody stirred memories of fallen comrades. An American guard, a farm boy from Nebraska named Danny, who'd been leaning against a fence post, listened intently. When Wolfgang finished, Danny asked, "You know any happy songs?" Wolfgang smiled and launched into a lively folk tune from the Rhineland. Within minutes, prisoners had gathered, some clapping, others joining in with vocal harmony. Danny found himself tapping his foot, drawn in despite himself. The next Sunday, when Wolfgang was part of a work crew invited to the Henderson farm for dinner, he brought his harmonica. After the meal, Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her daughter played piano. The girl, shy at first, sat at the upright in their parlor and played a halting version of Amazing Grace. Wolfgang listened, then lifted his harmonica and added a simple harmony. The effect was electric. The girl's confidence grew, her playing smoothed out, and for 3 minutes, an American teenager and a German prisoner created something beautiful together. "Play another," urged Mr. Henderson. They played hymns that both knew, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," translated differently but recognizable in any language. The shared musical heritage of Protestant Christianity became a bridge across the war. By the time the evening ended, they'd played a dozen songs, and Mrs. Henderson had tears in her eyes.
Music doesn't know about wars, she said. Similar scenes unfolded across prisoner work sites. At a farm in Iowa, prisoners taught the farmers' children German folk songs, Kein schöner Land and Die Gedanken sind frei. The kids, delighted by the strange sounds, sang them at school, causing minor controversy when a teacher objected to German being spoken in her classroom.
The controversy blew over when someone pointed out that half the town's grandparents had come from Germany themselves. The songs, after all, predated Nazis by centuries. Food became another language. When prisoners were invited to American homes, they brought what they could. Small carved wooden items made in camp workshops, sketches and drawings, and sometimes recipes written on scraps of paper. American women discovered German baking traditions, Pfeffernuss cookies, Stollen bread, Apfelkuchen, that their own German immigrant grandmothers had made. In turn, prisoners encountered American cuisine that bewildered and delighted them. Peanut butter sandwiches initially confused German palates. "This is dessert?" one asked, trying to reconcile sweet and salty. But they adapted quickly, especially to ice cream, which became legendary among POWs as proof of American abundance. Sweet corn on the cob puzzled them. In Germany, corn was animal feed. Green Jell-O salad with marshmallows seemed like some kind of practical joke. Casseroles mixing meat, vegetables, and canned soup violated every principle of German cooking. Yet, they ate it all gratefully, recognizing that American families were sharing from their ration supplies. The exchange went deeper than recipes. On a Sunday dinner in Texas, a prisoner named Ernst noticed the family's cookbook on a shelf, a Betty Crocker volume annotated with handwritten additions. He asked to see it, and through his halting English, explained that his mother kept a similar book in Stuttgart, passed down through 3 generations. The farmer's wife, moved by this connection, copied out her mother's apple pie recipe and gave it to Ernst. He promised to give it to his mother if he ever made it home. In 2003, Ernst's daughter would publish a memoir revealing that her grandmother had indeed received that recipe and their family had been making Texas apple pie for 3 generations. Stories wove the strongest connections. During long Sunday afternoons, after dishes were cleared and coffee served, conversations turned to the past. Prisoners spoke carefully about their lives before the war, childhoods in villages or cities, apprenticeships and schools, courtships and marriages. They described Germany before Nazism, when politics were complicated but life was normal. American families reciprocated. They talked about the Depression, about dust bowls and bank failures, about Roosevelt's programs that saved farms. They described sons who'd enlisted out of patriotic duty or simple lack of options, daughters who'd gone to work in factories, communities transformed by war production. These parallel narratives revealed common ground: economic hardship, political turmoil, young people shaped by forces beyond their control. Both sides had experienced versions of the same story. The prisoners learned that Americans hadn't lived in carefree prosperity before the war. The Americans learned that not every German had enthusiastically supported Hitler. Children asked the most direct questions, blessedly free of adult filters. "Why did you fight for the bad guys?" a 7-year-old asked a prisoner at a Nebraska farmhouse. The prisoner, a former schoolteacher, thought carefully before answering. "I was a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. I did not choose the war." "But you could have said no." "In Germany," the prisoner replied slowly, "saying no could mean death for you and your family." The child processed this, then asked, "Are you glad you lost?" Another careful pause. "I am glad the war will end. I am glad I will see my children again. I am not happy my country is destroyed, but yes, perhaps it is better this way." The adults in the room sat silent, recognizing a profound admission. This German soldier had just acknowledged, in front of his captors, that Germany's defeat was just. It was a moment of moral clarity that propaganda could never produce. Shared labor created its own understanding. When prisoners worked American farms, they fell into rhythms that transcended nationality. A German who'd grown up milking cows moved with the same practiced efficiency as an American who'd done the same. They discussed cattle diseases, crop rotation, weather patterns, the eternal concerns of farmers everywhere. At a Minnesota dairy farm, a prisoner named Hans explained a German technique for treating mastitis in cows. The farmer, skeptical, tried it on a heifer. When the treatment worked, he admitted, "That's smarter than what our vet recommended." "My grandfather taught me," Hans replied. "His grandfather taught him. Some knowledge is older than countries." The religious dimension of these encounters deserves emphasis. America in the 1940s was openly, unself-consciously Christian in ways that would seem foreign to later generations. Grace before meals wasn't performative, but genuine. Sunday church attendance was near universal in rural communities. Biblical literacy was assumed. The German prisoners, mostly from Christian backgrounds themselves, recognized this shared foundation. When American families prayed before meals, the prisoners understood the ritual. When discussions touched on faith, they found common ground in Protestant hymns or Catholic liturgy. A Methodist minister in Kansas invited prisoners of war to attend Sunday services under guard. Some townspeople objected, but the minister was firm. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. I think we can manage sitting in the same room as German prisoners. The prisoners who attended were moved by the experience. One later wrote, "I had not been in a church in 2 years. To hear hymns sung in English that I knew in German, to take communion alongside those whose sons fight against us, it reminded me that God does not recognize our human borders." This wasn't universal, of course. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis, refusing to engage with American culture or people. Some American families maintained strict distance, unable or unwilling to see past the uniform. The divides of war were real and deep. But where cultural bridges did form, they proved remarkably sturdy. Prisoners who had entered Sunday dinners expecting polite coldness found warmth. Americans who had invited prisoners out of abstract Christian duty discovered actual people worth knowing. By late 1944, the cultural exchange had become institutionalized in some areas. Camps organized English classes with volunteer American teachers. German orchestras performed for local communities. Art exhibitions displayed paintings and woodwork created by the prisoners. The events carried disclaimers. This is not fraternization, but cultural understanding. But everyone knew the distinctions were growing blurry. The music, food, stories, and shared labor were creating something unprecedented. A community of enemies learning to coexist. It wasn't friendship exactly. The war was still being fought. People were still dying. But it was a foundation. When victory finally came, this foundation would prove crucial. January 1945 brought news that tormented the prisoners. Germany was collapsing. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last gasp. Soviet forces were crushing toward Berlin from the east. Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble nightly. Mail from home, when it came at all, described conditions that made the prisoners' American captivity seem obscene by contrast. Otto Becker received a letter from his wife in Hamburg, Germany. The censor had blacked out sections, but enough remained to paint a horrifying picture. Their apartment building destroyed by firebombs, the family living in a cellar, their children eating once a day if they were lucky. His wife's neat handwriting concluded, "But you must not worry about us. We survive. Write of how you are treated so I know you are safe." Otto sat in the camp mess hall that evening, staring at a plate that held more food than his family saw in a week. Roast beef, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, apple pie for dessert. The abundance mocked him. He couldn't eat. When a fellow prisoner asked why, he showed him the letter. Word spread quickly through the barracks. That night, men lay on their bunks wrestling with guilt that gnawed worse than any wound. They were safe. They were fed. They were warm. They received medical care. They played soccer and attended concerts and carved wooden toys in workshops. Meanwhile, their families dodged bombs, huddled in ruined buildings, and stood in breadlines for rations that wouldn't keep a child alive. The psychological burden became almost unbearable for some. At Camp Concordia, a prisoner named Friedrich refused to eat for 3 days after learning his hometown of Dresden had been firebombed. The doctor forced liquids into him and eventually talked him into eating, but Friedrich never fully recovered his spirits. "I am alive because I am away from Germany. My family is dying because they are in it. What justice is this?" The Sunday dinners took on new complexity. When prisoners sat at American tables laden with food, they couldn't help calculating this single meal feeds 6 German families for a week. The generosity that had once seemed like grace now felt like accusation.
Some prisoners tried to refuse invitations. Guards reported men claiming illness to avoid going to farms. When pressed, they admitted they couldn't bear the contrast between American plenty and German suffering. The war was turning, and every meal they ate felt like betrayal. American families noticed the change. The prisoners, who had been gradually opening up, sharing stories and even laughter, now retreated into polite silence. Martha Henderson, who had hosted the same crew for months, confronted Klaus directly. "What's wrong? Have we offended you?" Klaus struggled with English and emotion. Finally, he pulled out a creased letter and pushed it across the table. "My mother. She writes, no food, no home. She sleeps in church basement." Martha read the letter, tears forming. "Klaus, I'm so sorry." "You are kind," Klaus said quietly. "This makes it worse. You should hate us. We bomb England. We kill your soldiers. But you feed us, invite us to homes, treat us like sons. My mother starves while I eat pie. How can I—" He couldn't finish. Martha had no answer. The moral mathematics of war didn't balance. She did what she could, packed extra food for Klaus to take back to camp, knowing it was inadequate, knowing it changed nothing for his mother in Germany. The paradox deepened as news of concentration camps began circulating in early 1945. When American forces liberated camps in Germany, the photographs and reports reached the United States quickly. Newspapers published images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic atrocities that exceeded even the darkest wartime propaganda. American families who had been hosting German prisoners of war struggled with the revelation. How could they continue inviting these men to Sunday dinner when Germany had committed such horrors? Some stopped the invitations immediately. Others doubled down, insisting that these prisoners weren't responsible for Nazi crimes. Conversations grew more difficult. At a farm in Iowa, the family patriarch confronted his German workers directly. "Did you know about the camps, the murders, all of it?" The prisoners had seen the newsreels too. Camp commanders made them watch as part of re-education efforts. Some claimed complete ignorance. Others admitted to rumors they'd heard but dismissed as exaggeration. A few confessed they had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. "We are soldiers," one said defensively. "We fight on battlefields. These camps, these crimes, we did not do this." "But your country did," the farmer pressed. "Your government, your people." "Yes," the prisoner admitted quietly. "My country did this. I cannot defend it. I am ashamed." That admission, public shame for Germany's crimes, became more common as evidence mounted. The prisoners who had maintained firm Nazi sympathies
found their positions increasingly untenable. How could they defend a regime that had built murder factories? The ideological certainty that had sustained some POWs crumbled in the face of Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. For American families, the revelations forced a reckoning. They'd been treating these Germans as wayward boys caught in bad circumstances. Now they had to confront that these men were citizens of a nation that had committed unprecedented evil. The dinners continued for some families, ceased for others. There was no clear answer, no resolution that satisfied both justice and mercy. The prisoners themselves split into camps. Some shut down entirely, refusing to discuss the Holocaust or the war's end. Others sought out conversations, asking American hosts to help them understand how their nation had fallen so far. A few became advocates, insisting to fellow prisoners that Germany deserved defeat. At Camp Clarinda, Iowa, in April 1945, a prisoner named Helmut stood in the mess hall and made a speech that fellow prisoners of war remembered for decades. We were told Americans were weak, cruel, and decadent. We find them strong, kind, and decent. We were told our cause was just. We find our nation built death camps. Everything we believed was lies. The war is ending. Germany is destroyed. Perhaps it is right that Germany is destroyed. We must learn from this. Some prisoners attacked him. Others wept. Most sat in silence, wrestling with the collapse of everything they'd known. The burden of abundance remained, but its meaning shifted. Initially, prisoners felt guilty for eating well while Germany starved. Now, some began to see their treatment in America as a model for what Germany should have been: prosperous, generous, democratic. They'd been captured by a nation fighting for survival, yet still maintaining values of decency. They'd been defeated by a people who invited enemies to Sunday dinner. That realization that Germany had fought on the wrong side not just militarily, but morally, changed many prisoners permanently. They would return to Germany carrying not just memories of American kindness, but recognition that their nation needed fundamental transformation. The Sunday dinners in spring 1945 became quieter, more somber, weighted by knowledge of what was ending and what would have to be rebuilt. But they continued, these strange gatherings of former enemies sharing meals, while the world reshuffled itself into new configurations.
May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The news crackled through camp loudspeakers and radios across America. The war that had consumed Europe for 6 years was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. In POW camps from Texas to Minnesota, German prisoners received the news with reactions ranging from despair to relief to carefully concealed joy. For some, it marked the end of everything they'd known. For others, it meant they might finally see families they'd been separated from for years. A few quietly celebrated that the nightmare of Nazism was finished. But going home proved more complicated than anyone anticipated. The repatriation process moved slowly. Germany was in ruins, divided into occupation zones, barely functioning as a state. There was no government to negotiate with, no infrastructure to receive millions of returning soldiers. The Allies struggled with the logistics of sorting through prisoners, separating ardent Nazis from regular soldiers, identifying war criminals, processing millions of men. In America, POWs who had expected rapid repatriation faced months or even years of continued captivity. The work programs continued. Farms still needed labor. The American agricultural sector, having grown dependent on German workers, lobbied to keep them longer. The Sunday dinners took on bittersweet tones. Prisoners knew they were leaving eventually,
and American families had grown attached to men who'd become familiar. Farewells began early, extending over months. At the Brennan farmhouse in Kansas, Sarah continued inviting her regular crew through summer 1945. The conversations now turned toward the future. What would Germany look like? Could families be reunited? Would there be food, shelter, work? The prisoners voiced fears that American families couldn't fully understand. They were returning to a country that had been bombed into rubble, occupied by foreign armies, stripped of its government and pride. Many cities existed only as landscapes of ruins. Millions were homeless. Starvation was widespread. "I don't know if my family is alive," Johann admitted during one dinner. "My last letter from Munich was 6 months ago. The city has been bombed dozens of times since. I may return to find no one." Sarah gripped his hand. "Then you'll write to us. You'll let us know. We'll help if we can." These promises to maintain contact, to remember each other, to help in whatever ways possible, became common as repatriation approached. Prisoners and American families exchanged addresses, knowing that mail might not reach across the Atlantic for years, but hoping anyway. The first large-scale repatriations began in late 1945. Ships that had brought troops to Europe now carried German prisoners back. The voyages reversed the journey made years earlier, but the prisoners were different men than those who had arrived. They had expected brutality and found hospitality. They had anticipated starvation and enjoyed abundance. They had been taught that Americans were enemies and discovered they were people. The cognitive shift couldn't be undone. Otto Becker, boarding a Liberty ship in Boston Harbor in December 1945, looked back at America with complex emotions. He was eager to reunite with his family, but dreading what he'd find in Hamburg. He carried in his duffel bag gifts from American families, canned goods, chocolate, tobacco, items that were gold in devastated Germany. He also carried addresses, photographs, and memories that would stay with him the rest of his life. The return to Germany shocked even those who'd heard reports. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin resembled lunar landscapes, endless miles of rubble where buildings had stood, streetcars running through canyons of destroyed buildings, hollow-eyed civilians picking through ruins. But in the midst of this devastation, returning prisoners of war brought unusual stories. At a refugee center in Hamburg, Otto found his family alive but gaunt, living in a basement. His children barely recognized him. His wife had aged a decade in 4 years. They expected tales of suffering from his captivity. Instead, Otto described Sunday dinners. He showed his children photographs of American families. He gave them chocolate bars that the Nebraska family had sent him with. And he told them, carefully, aware of how it might sound, that Germany had been wrong. The Americans could have starved us, beaten us, killed us. We destroyed Europe. We built death camps. They had every right to treat us as we treated others, but they didn't. They invited us to their tables. They treated us with dignity we didn't deserve. His wife stared at him. "You speak like they were right to destroy Germany." "They were right to stop Germany. What we did, what our government did, was evil. We have to rebuild differently." Similar conversations occurred across occupied Germany. Returning prisoners were, particularly those who had been in America, brought back troubling testimonies about American plenty, democracy, and decency. Some Germans dismissed these stories as propaganda or betrayal. Others listened carefully, recognizing that these men had seen something important. The stories affected Germany's emerging post-war consciousness. As the Allies worked to denazify German society, these returning prisoners served as witnesses that another way of life existed, one based on democracy, rule of law, and treatment of defeated enemies with humanity rather than vengeance.
Not all prisoners went directly home.
Some, particularly those whose families had been in areas now controlled by the Soviet Union, faced impossible choices. Return to Soviet occupation meant probable arrest and deportation to gulags. Many chose to remain in displaced persons camps, hoping for opportunities to emigrate elsewhere. A number of former POWs eventually returned to America as immigrants. Hans Vogel, who had worked Minnesota dairy farms, corresponded with the family who'd hosted him for Sunday dinners. In 1953, they sponsored his immigration. He returned to Minnesota, married an American woman of German descent, and farmed the same land he'd worked as a prisoner. His was not unique. Dozens of former POWs, perhaps hundreds, eventually immigrated to America, drawn by memories of treatment they'd received and opportunities unavailable in devastated Germany. They brought German work ethic and craftsmanship, integrated into American communities, and raised children who grew up hearing stories of the strange war where their fathers had been enemies before becoming neighbors. The last German POWs left American soil in 1946. Camps closed, barracks were dismantled, and the barbed wire came down. The farmland returned to American use, the guard towers were removed, and the temporary cities that had housed 40,000 prisoners vanished as if they'd never existed. But the memories didn't fade. American families kept photographs of German prisoners who'd shared their Sunday tables. Former guards recounted the strange duty of supervising men who became almost friendly over time. Children who'd played with prisoners grew up telling their own children about the German soldiers who'd carved wooden toys or taught them songs. For the Germans, the memories proved even more powerful. They had witnessed American democracy and prosperity at a moment when Germany's alternative had failed catastrophically. The contrast couldn't be forgotten. As Germany rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, with American aid flowing to former enemies, many Germans remembered that American generosity wasn't new. They'd experienced it personally, in camp mess halls, on work details, and most intimately, around Sunday dinner tables, where enemies had become guests. The seeds planted during those unlikely dinners would germinate in unexpected ways. The farmhouse outside Minden, Nebraska, stood unchanged by the decades. In September 1985, an elderly man drove up the gravel driveway in a rental car. He moved slowly, age having caught up with him, but his eyes were bright as he approached the front door. The woman who answered was in her 70s, but she recognized him immediately. "Eric?" she said, disbelieving. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," he replied, in accented but fluent English. "I promised I would return." This scene repeated itself dozens of times in the 1970s and 1980s. Former German POWs, now successful businessmen or retired workers, returned to America as tourists. They sought out the farms where they'd worked, the families who'd invited them to Sunday dinner, the places where they'd experienced unexpected kindness 40 years earlier. Walter Morrison, Martha Henderson, Sarah Brennan, these names appeared in German memoirs and oral histories as Americans who changed prisoners' understanding of the world. The Sunday dinners, decades past, remained vivid in memories while battles faded. The historical legacy of these encounters extended beyond personal relationships. In the 1950s, as America and West Germany became Cold War allies, the relationships formed during captivity helped smooth the transition from enemies to partners. Germans who had lived in America returned with generally positive views of American culture and democratic values. This influenced post-war German society in subtle but significant ways. Historians later documented how POW camps, particularly those in America, served as unexpected schools for democracy. Prisoners witnessed functioning democratic institutions, read uncensored newspapers, and experienced prosperity built on systems utterly different from totalitarian control. When they returned to help rebuild Germany, many advocated for democratic reforms. The Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s drew explicitly on American models. Former POWs who had seen American agriculture, industry, and commerce firsthand pushed for similar approaches in Germany. The Marshall Plan succeeded partly because Germans already familiar with American systems could implement them effectively. The cultural exchange continued through correspondence that lasted decades. Families in Kansas exchanged Christmas cards with families in Bavaria. A farmer in Texas learned his German worker had become a successful vintner and exchanged bottles of wine for bottles of bourbon. The connections, personal and particular, created networks of understanding that official diplomacy couldn't replicate. Researchers in the 1990s began collecting oral histories from both former prisoners and American families. The testimonies revealed consistent themes: surprise at unexpected kindness, the humanizing effect of shared meals, the recognition of common humanity across enemy lines. Dr. Klaus Fischer, author of Hitler's Enemies, interviewed 200 former POWs who had been held in America. Over 70% mentioned Sunday dinners or similar hospitality as transformative experiences. We arrived expecting concentration camps. We found something we couldn't process: Americans who treated us better than our own army had.
The Sunday dinners also influenced how America thought about its defeated enemies. The positive experiences with German POWs arguably helped shape more generous post-war policies. Having seen that Germans were people rather than monsters, Americans proved more willing to support rebuilding Germany rather than punishing it indefinitely. This pattern would repeat imperfectly with other former enemies. Japanese Americans who had been interned during the war often noted the contrast between their treatment and that of German POWs, a painful irony that forced American reckoning with its own prejudices. But the principle that humane treatment of defeated enemies served long-term peace influenced American approaches to post-war Japan as well. The children and grandchildren of both POWs and host families carried the stories forward. In a 2018 documentary, the granddaughter of Sarah Brennan interviewed the grandson of Johann, the German teacher who had attended Sunday dinners in Kansas. They met at the same farmhouse, now a historic site, and shared memories passed down through generations. "My grandfather spoke of these dinners his entire life," Johann's grandson said. "He told us that Americans had shown him what democracy looked like, not in theory, but in practice. Ordinary people sharing what they had with those they had every reason to hate." Sarah's granddaughter replied, "My grandmother said those dinners taught her that there were no real enemies, only people caught on different sides of terrible conflicts. She believed that if you could sit across a table from someone, share a meal, you couldn't keep hating them." The physical remnants of POW camps have largely disappeared. A few foundations remain, some historical markers, a handful of museums, but the real monuments exist in family photo albums. Images of German prisoners standing with American families, children held in enemy arms, tables laden with food shared across battle lines. These photographs testify to something remarkable. During history's bloodiest conflict, with casualties in the millions and atrocities on scales unprecedented, ordinary American families practiced a radical hospitality that defied every logic of war. They invited enemies to Sunday dinner. The decision to extend such invitations carried no grand strategy, claimed no political purpose, served no military objective. It emerged from simpler impulses: Christian charity, rural hospitality traditions, recognition of shared humanity, and perhaps simple decency that refused to be suspended even in wartime. Yet the consequences proved profound. Seeds planted around dinner tables in Nebraska and Texas and Kansas grew into lasting friendships, cultural exchange, and eventually geopolitical partnership between nations that had tried to destroy each other. This is not a story with a neat moral. The German POWs were treated humanely, yes, but they represented a nation that had committed genocide. The American families showed generosity, yes, but their country simultaneously interned Japanese Americans and enforced racial segregation. The Sunday dinners created genuine connection, yes, but didn't prevent the war's continuation or halt its atrocities. What the dinners did accomplish was smaller and perhaps more important. They preserved the possibility of reconciliation. They kept alive the knowledge on both sides that the enemy was human. When peace finally came,
That knowledge proved invaluable. In the depths of Kula Gulf, USS Helena keeps her last watch. In quiet farmhouses across Middle America, memories linger of Sunday dinners shared with German prisoners of war. Both stories testify to the same truth. In humanity's darkest hours, small acts of decency shine brightest. The German prisoners arrived on American shores expecting brutality. They found apple pie instead. They boarded ships thinking they faced certain death. They disembarked to offers of coffee. They worked American fields under guard, but ate at American tables as guests. Those Sunday dinners, so ordinary, so radical, remind us that even in the midst of total war, humanity has choices. We can see only enemies, or we can see people. We can extend only fists, or we can extend hands. We can close doors, or we can open them. The families who opened their doors in 1943, 1944, and 1945 weren't saints. They were farmers and small-town Americans doing what seemed right, according to values they'd been raised with. They probably never imagined that their simple hospitality would influence post-war relations between nations or appear in history books decades later. But it did. The Sunday dinners became part of the story of how enemies became allies, how war gave way to peace, how hatred could be unlearned if given the chance. Today, in Germany, elderly men still speak of Nebraska with warmth. In America, rural families still keep photographs of German soldiers who once worked their land. The connections forged across those Sunday tables outlasted the war that created them. This is their legacy. Proof that when faced with the enemy, Americans chose to see humans, and in choosing to share meals rather than simply guard prisoners, they planted seeds of reconciliation that would bloom long after the guns fell silent. They invited the enemy to Sunday dinner, and in doing so, they changed the world, one meal at a time.